The sun rises over Dodge City, Kansas, on a sweltering morning in July 1878. You step off the train, your modern sensibilities intact, your smartphone dead weight in your pocket, your credit cards useless pieces of plastic. The smell hits you. First, a nauseating cocktail of horse manure, unwashed bodies, rotting meat, and gunpowder residue that hangs in the air like a toxic cloud. Welcome to the American frontier, where the average life expectancy hovers around 35 years, and that's if you're lucky enough to avoid the bullets, disease, starvation, and countless other ways this unforgiving landscape will try to kill you before nightfall. You think you know the Wild West from movies and television shows, but the Hollywood version is a sanitized fairy tale compared to the brutal reality that awaited anyone foolish enough to venture into this lawless expanse. This wasn't a place of noble gunslingers and honorable outlaws. This was a meat grinder of human suffering, where violence was as common as breathing, and death lurked around every corner with the patience of a seasoned predator. Within the first hour of your arrival, you'd face challenges that would break the spirit of even the most hardened modern survivalist. The water you desperately need to drink is contaminated with cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. The food available would make you violently ill within minutes. The people around you carry diseases that modern medicine has all but eradicated, and they're armed with weapons they won't hesitate to use for the slightest provocation. But let's start with the basics. The very air you breathe in this frontier hellscape is trying to kill you. The dust storms that sweep across the plains carry more than just dirt. They're loaded with microscopic particles that will shred your lungs from the inside out. The air is so thick with particulates that many settlers developed what they called prairie lung, a condition that would slowly suffocate them over months or years. Your modern respiratory system, accustomed to filtered air and climate control, would begin to fail within hours of exposure to this toxic atmosphere. The temperature extremes alone would send you into shock. Summer days in places like Arizona Territory could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit, while winter nights in Montana Territory could plummet to 40 below zero. There was no air conditioning, no central heating, no insulation worth mentioning. Settlers lived in crude shelters that offered little protection from the elements. Many froze to death in their sleep, while others died of heat stroke in the middle of the day. Your body, accustomed to climate-controlled environments, would struggle to regulate its temperature in these extreme conditions. The wildlife was another level of terror entirely. Grizzly bears roamed freely, standing 9 feet tall and weighing up to 800 pounds. These weren't the habituated bears of modern national parks. These were wild, unpredictable killing machines that saw humans as either prey or competition. A single swipe of a grizzly's paw could decapitate a horse. Mountain lions stalked settlers with the patience of professional assassins, while wolves hunted in coordinated packs that could take down a grown man in seconds. But the 4-legged predators were nothing compared to the 2-legged ones. The frontier attracted the worst elements of humanity: murderers, rapists, thieves, and psychopaths who fled civilized society to escape justice. These weren't romanticized outlaws with hearts of gold. They were brutal criminals who would kill you for the clothes on your back or the few coins in your pocket. Violence was so commonplace that many frontier towns had boot hills, graveyards specifically for those who died violently, usually in gunfights. The famous Dodge City, often portrayed as a rough but manageable cowtown, was actually a cesspool of violence and depravity. Between 1876 and 1885, there were over 100 documented murders in a town with a population that never exceeded 5,000. That's a murder rate of approximately 2,000 per 100,000 people, more than 40 times higher than the modern United States. And those were just the documented cases. Countless others disappeared into the prairie, their bodies never found, their deaths never recorded. The law enforcement, such as it was, often proved more dangerous than the criminals. Many sheriffs and marshals were former outlaws themselves, hired more for their willingness to kill than their dedication to justice. The famous Wyatt Earp, lionized in Hollywood productions, was actually a cold-blooded killer who used his badge to settle personal vendettas. The gunfight at the OK Corral wasn't a heroic showdown between good and evil. It was a brutal execution of men who had crossed the Earp brothers in business dealings. Corruption was endemic throughout the frontier. Judges could be bought for the price of a bottle of whiskey. Juries were often intimidated or bribed. The concept of due process was a luxury that few could afford. Vigilante justice was the norm, and lynch mobs formed at the slightest provocation. If you were accused of a crime, guilty or not, your chances of surviving to see a fair trial were virtually non-existent. The economic system was designed to exploit and crush the weak. Everything was expensive beyond belief because of the enormous costs and risks of transporting goods across vast distances. A simple meal that might cost you a few dollars today would cost the equivalent of $50 in a frontier town. A bottle of whiskey, often the only available anesthetic for medical procedures, could cost a month's wages for a working man. Speaking of medical procedures, the healthcare available on the frontier was worse than no healthcare at all. Doctors were rare, and most of those who did practice medicine had little to no formal training. They were more likely to kill you with their treatments than cure you of whatever ailment brought you to them. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, using unsterilized instruments in filthy conditions. The mortality rate for any surgical procedure was astronomical. The most common medical treatments involved bleeding the patient with leeches or cutting them with razors, administering mercury-based compounds that caused severe poisoning, or dosing them with laudanum, liquid opium that created more addicts than it helped patients. Many frontier doctors were simply con men who had learned a few medical terms and set up shop in towns desperate enough to accept anyone claiming medical knowledge. Dental care was even worse. Toothaches were treated by pulling the tooth with crude pliers, again without anesthesia. Most frontier dwellers lost all their teeth by age 30, if they lived that long. The constant pain from dental problems drove many to suicide or madness. The food supply was a constant source of danger. Fresh meat was a luxury available only to those rich enough to afford it, and even then, it was often spoiled by the time it reached the consumer. Most settlers survived on salt pork, hardtack, and beans, a diet that led to scurvy, rickets, and other nutritional diseases. The salt pork was often rancid, the hardtack was infested with weevils, and the beans were frequently contaminated with mold or rodent droppings. Water was an even bigger problem. Clean, safe drinking water was virtually impossible to find on the frontier. Most water sources were contaminated with human and animal waste, leading to frequent outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. These diseases could kill a healthy adult in a matter of days, and they spread through communities like wildfire. Entire towns would be wiped out by waterborne illnesses, leaving behind nothing but empty buildings and mass graves. The lack of refrigeration meant that any food not consumed immediately would spoil in the heat. Milk would sour within hours. Meat would begin to rot before it could be properly cooked. Fruits and vegetables were almost impossible to preserve, leading to widespread malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies. The clothing available on the frontier was inadequate for the harsh conditions. Most settlers wore the same clothes day after day, week after week, without washing them. The fabrics were rough and uncomfortable, offering little protection from the elements. Boots fell apart within months, leaving people to walk barefoot across terrain filled with thorns, rattlesnakes, and broken glass. Hygiene was virtually non-existent. Most people bathed once a month if they were lucky, and often went much longer without washing. This led to widespread infestations of lice, fleas, and other parasites. Skin diseases were common and often fatal. The smell of unwashed bodies was so pervasive that it became a defining characteristic of frontier life. The social isolation was crushing. Many settlers lived hundreds of miles from the nearest neighbor, with no communication with the outside world for months at a time. The psychological toll of this isolation was enormous. Depression, anxiety, and mental illness were rampant, but there were no treatments available. Many settlers simply went insane from the loneliness and hardship. Women faced additional horrors. On the frontier, they were viewed as property, with few rights and little protection. Sexual assault was common and rarely punished. Childbirth was extremely dangerous, with mortality rates for both mothers and infants that would shock modern sensibilities. Many women died in childbirth, and those who survived often faced a lifetime of complications from crude medical procedures. Children had even shorter life expectancies. Infant mortality rates exceeded 50% in many frontier communities. Those who survived infancy faced constant threats from disease, accidents, and violence. Education was almost non-existent, leaving most children illiterate and unprepared for anything but the hardest physical labor. The weather was a constant enemy. Prairie fires could consume thousands of acres in hours, moving faster than a horse could run. Tornadoes were common and devastating, with no warning systems to alert people to their approach. Blizzards could bury entire settlements under feet of snow, trapping people in their homes without food or fuel for weeks. Floods were equally devastating. Rivers would rise suddenly after heavy rains, washing away entire communities. The Missouri River alone claimed thousands of lives during the frontier period, earning it the nickname Big Muddy for both its appearance and its deadly nature. Drought was perhaps the most insidious threat of all. It could last for years, turning fertile farmland into barren wasteland. Crops would fail, livestock would die, and entire communities would be forced to abandon their homes in search of water. Many died of thirst while attempting these desperate migrations. The transportation available on the frontier was primitive and dangerous. Stagecoaches were death traps, frequently overturning or breaking down in the middle of nowhere. The drivers were often drunk or incompetent, and the roads were little more than rutted trails that became impassable in bad weather. River travel was equally perilous. Steamboats exploded regularly, killing everyone aboard. The rivers were filled with snags, submerged trees that could tear a hole in a boat's hull in seconds. Many boats simply disappeared, swallowed by the muddy waters along with their passengers and cargo. Horseback riding, the most common form of transportation, came with its own set of dangers. Horses were expensive and hard to maintain. They required constant care and feeding, and they were prone to injury and disease. A lame horse on the frontier was often a death sentence for its rider, stranding them miles from help in hostile territory. The Native American tribes, understandably hostile to the encroachment of white settlers on their ancestral lands, posed a constant threat. The frontier was a war zone, with raids and counter-raids occurring regularly. Settlers lived in constant fear of attack, and many were killed or captured. Those who were captured often faced torture and death, though some were adopted into tribes and lived to tell their stories. The military presence on the frontier was minimal and often ineffective. Army posts were few and far between, and the soldiers were poorly equipped and trained. They were more interested in staying alive than in protecting settlers, and they often ignored pleas for help. When they did respond to threats, it was usually too late to prevent massacres. The economic opportunities that supposedly drew people to the frontier were largely illusions. The California gold rush, for example, made very few people rich. Most prospectors lost everything they had, dying poor and forgotten in remote mining camps. The cost of supplies was so high that even successful miners often ended up in debt. Farming on the frontier was a losing proposition for most settlers. The soil was often poor, The climate was harsh, and the markets were too distant to make agriculture profitable. Many farmers worked themselves to death trying to scratch a living from unforgiving land, only to lose their farms to creditors or abandon them in desperation. Cattle ranching, romanticized in countless Western movies, was equally brutal. Cowboys were poorly paid laborers who faced enormous risks for minimal rewards. They were often injured or killed by angry cattle thrown from horses or caught in stampedes. The glamorous life of the cowboy was a myth created by dime novels and later perpetuated by Hollywood. The towns that sprang up along the frontier were cesspools of vice and corruption. Gambling was the primary form of entertainment, and it was almost always rigged in favor of the house. Prostitution was rampant, spreading venereal diseases that had no cure. Alcoholism was epidemic, with many settlers drinking themselves to death to escape the horror of their daily existence. Violence was the primary method of conflict resolution. Disputes over land, water rights, or card games routinely ended in gunfights. The famous Code of the West was largely a fictional construct. In reality, people shot each other over trivial matters with frightening regularity. The quick-draw duels portrayed in movies were rare. Most killings were cold-blooded murders, often committed by shooting someone in the back. The justice system was arbitrary and corrupt. Judges were often unqualified and biased. Juries were easily intimidated or bribed. Trials were rushed affairs with predetermined outcomes. The death penalty was common and carried out publicly, often by hanging, though burning and other forms of execution were not unknown. Prisons were overcrowded, filthy hellholes where inmates were more likely to die of disease than serve their sentences. Many prisoners were worked to death in chain gangs or simply executed for minor crimes. The concept of rehabilitation was unknown. The goal was punishment, and it was administered with brutal efficiency. The communication systems on the frontier were primitive and unreliable. The Pony Express, celebrated in American folklore, was actually a short-lived financial disaster that operated for only 18 months. Most mail never reached its destination, and what did get through was often months old by the time it arrived. Telegraph. Lines were few and far between, and they were constantly being cut by hostile Native Americans or destroyed by weather. Even when they worked, telegraph operators were often drunk or incompetent, garbling messages beyond recognition. The lack of reliable communication meant that help was rarely available when needed. People died of treatable injuries simply because no one knew they were hurt. Entire communities could be wiped out by disease or violence, and no one would know about it for months. The educational system on the frontier was virtually non-existent. Most children received no formal education at all. Those lucky enough to attend school learned little beyond basic reading and arithmetic. Books were scarce and expensive, and teachers were often barely literate themselves. The lack of education perpetuated a cycle of ignorance and superstition. Medical knowledge was limited to folk remedies and old wives' tales. Scientific understanding was minimal, leading to dangerous practices and beliefs. Many people believed that bathing was unhealthy, that disease was caused by bad air, and that prayer was more effective than medicine. The religious communities on the frontier were often as dangerous as the secular ones. Many religious leaders were con men who used their supposed divine authority to exploit their followers. Some religious communities practiced polygamy, child marriage, and other forms of abuse. The Mormon communities in Utah Territory, for example, were essentially theocratic dictatorships where dissent was brutally suppressed. The racial tensions on the frontier were explosive. Native Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Chinese immigrants all faced systemic discrimination and violence. Lynchings were common, and entire communities of minorities could be wiped out by angry mobs. The famous Indian Wars, were acts of genocide, with the U.S. government systematically exterminating Native American tribes to clear the land for white settlement. The environmental destruction caused by frontier expansion was catastrophic. Massive buffalo herds that had roamed the plains for thousands of years were slaughtered to near extinction in just a few decades. Forests were clear-cut without regard for conservation. Rivers were polluted with mining waste and human sewage. The delicate ecosystem of the Great Plains was destroyed by overgrazing and poor farming practices, leading to the dust storms that would later devastate the region. The psychological toll of frontier life was enormous. Depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses were common, but there were no treatments available. Many settlers simply went insane from the stress and isolation. Suicide rates were astronomical, with many people choosing death over the continued suffering of frontier existence. The substance abuse problems on the frontier were severe. Alcohol was consumed in massive quantities as a way to cope with the harsh realities of daily life. Opium and other drugs were readily available and widely used. Many settlers became addicts, further reducing their chances of survival. The domestic violence on the frontier was endemic. With no law enforcement to speak of, women and children were completely at the mercy of abusive men. Wife beating was considered normal, and children were often brutally disciplined. Many families were torn apart by violence and abuse. The child labor on the frontier was appalling. Children as young as 5 were expected to work alongside adults, performing dangerous tasks that often resulted in injury or death. There were no child labor laws, no protections for children, and no concept of childhood as a time for play and learning. The sexual exploitation of women and children was rampant. Prostitution was legal and widely accepted, with many women forced into the trade by economic necessity. Child prostitution was common and rarely prosecuted. Sexual assault was epidemic, with victims having no recourse to justice. The slavery that existed on the frontier was brutal even by the standards of the time. Many territories allowed slavery, and the conditions for enslaved people were often worse than in the established slave states. There was no oversight, no protection, and no hope of freedom. The indentured servitude that was common on the frontier was little better than slavery. Many immigrants were forced to work for years to pay off the cost of their passage to America, often under conditions that amounted to slavery. The contracts were usually rigged in favor of the employers, and the workers had no legal recourse. The land ownership system on the frontier was corrupt and unjust. The Homestead Act, which promised free land to settlers, was riddled with loopholes that allowed wealthy speculators to acquire vast tracts of land. Many honest settlers found their claims contested by people with better lawyers or more political connections. The water rights disputes on the frontier often led to violence and death. Water was scarce and precious, and control of water sources meant the difference between life and death. Many settlers were killed defending their water rights, and entire communities were forced to relocate when their water sources were claimed by others. The mining operations on the frontier were death. Traps, cave-ins, explosions, and toxic gases killed thousands of miners. The working conditions were appalling, with miners working 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions for minimal pay. Many miners died of lung diseases caused by inhaling dust and toxic particles. The railroad construction that opened up the frontier was built on the backs of exploited workers. Chinese immigrants and Irish immigrants were worked to death building the transcontinental railroad. The casualty rates were enormous, with workers dying from explosions, cave-ins, and exposure. The companies that built the railroads showed no concern for worker safety, viewing their employees as expendable. The Buffalo Soldiers, African-American cavalry units that served on the frontier, faced discrimination and violence from both white settlers and Native Americans. Despite their exemplary service record, they were denied recognition and respect. Many were killed in action or died from disease and neglect. The cattle drives that moved herds from Texas to Kansas were incredibly dangerous. Cowboys faced stampedes, river crossings, hostile Native Americans, and violent weather. Many cowboys were killed or seriously injured during these drives. The famous Chisholm Trail was littered with the graves of cowboys who died trying to move cattle to market. The sheep herders on the frontier faced unique dangers. They were often attacked by cattle ranchers who viewed sheep as competition for grazing land. The sheep wars that erupted in several states led to numerous deaths and the destruction of entire flocks. The fur trappers and mountain men who explored the frontier faced extreme dangers. They lived alone in the wilderness for months at a time, facing grizzly bears, mountain lions, and hostile Native Americans. Many simply disappeared, their bodies never found. Those who survived often suffered from scurvy, frostbite, and other diseases. The supply chains that kept frontier communities alive were tenuous and unreliable. Wagon trains carrying supplies were often attacked by Native Americans or outlaws. River barges carrying goods were frequently sunk or destroyed. Even when supplies got through, they were often spoiled or damaged by the time they reached their destination. The banking system on the frontier was primitive and corrupt. Banks failed regularly, wiping out the savings of their depositors. There was no insurance, no regulation, and no oversight. Many banks were simply fronts for criminal enterprises, laundering money from illegal activities. The insurance industry on the frontier was virtually non-existent. There was no life insurance, no health insurance, and no property insurance. When disaster struck, people had no financial protection. A single fire, flood, or illness could wipe out a family's entire savings. The legal system on the frontier was corrupt and ineffective. Lawyers were often unqualified and dishonest. Courts were biased in favor of the wealthy and powerful. Justice was often purchased rather than earned. Many crimes went unpunished, while innocent people were convicted of crimes they didn't commit. The political system on the frontier was dominated by corruption and violence. Elections were often rigged, with ballot boxes stuffed or destroyed. Candidates were frequently threatened or killed. Political office was seen as a way to enrich oneself rather than serve the public good. The tax system on the frontier was arbitrary and unfair. Tax collectors were often corrupt, pocketing money that should have gone to the government. Tax rates were high, but the services provided by the government were minimal. Many people simply refused to pay taxes, leading to violent conflicts with tax collectors. The road system on the frontier was primitive and dangerous. Most roads were little more than trails that became impassable in bad weather. Bridges were rare and often unsafe. Many travelers died when their wagons overturned or became stuck in mud or snow. The bridge construction on the frontier was haphazard and dangerous. Many bridges were built without proper engineering, leading to collapses that killed dozens of people. The materials used were often substandard, and the construction techniques were primitive. The ferry systems that operated on frontier rivers were notoriously dangerous. Ferries regularly sank, drowning their passengers and cargo. The operators were often drunk or incompetent, and the boats were poorly maintained. Many people died trying to cross rivers on these death traps. The lighthouse systems on the Great Lakes and coastal areas were inadequate and poorly maintained. Many ships were wrecked because of failed lighthouse systems, leading to enormous loss of life and property. The lighthouse keepers were often unreliable, abandoning their posts or failing to maintain their equipment. The weather prediction systems on the frontier were non-existent. People had no way to prepare for storms, floods, or other weather emergencies. Many died because they were caught unprepared by sudden weather changes. The emergency response systems on the frontier were primitive. There were no paramedics, no ambulances, and no emergency hospitals. When disasters struck, people were on their own. The death toll from accidents, violence, and natural disasters was enormous because there was no effective emergency response. The fire departments on the frontier were volunteer organizations with primitive equipment. Most buildings were made of wood and burned easily. When fires started, they often consumed entire blocks or even entire towns. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 was just one example of how quickly fires could spread in frontier communities. The police departments on the frontier were often more dangerous than the criminals they were supposed to catch. Many police officers were former criminals themselves, hired for their willingness to use violence rather than their dedication to justice. Police corruption was endemic, with officers taking bribes and looking the other way when their friends committed crimes. The prison systems on the frontier were brutal and dehumanizing. Prisoners were often worked to death in chain gangs or simply executed for minor crimes. The conditions in frontier prisons were appalling, with inmates dying of disease, starvation, and violence. There was no concept of rehabilitation. The goal was punishment, and it was administered with brutal efficiency. The mental health care on the frontier was non-existent. People with mental illness were often chained up or locked away in deplorable conditions. There was no understanding of mental illness, and those who suffered from it were often viewed as possessed by demons or cursed by God. Many mentally ill people were simply abandoned to die. The addiction treatment on the frontier was non-existent. Alcoholism and drug addiction were rampant, but there were no treatment programs. Addicts were viewed as moral failures and left to die. The temperance movement that emerged in the late 19th century was more concerned with prohibition than treatment. The veterans' care on the frontier was virtually non-existent. Many Civil War veterans suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, but there were no treatments available. Veterans were often left to fend for themselves, and many ended up homeless or in poverty. The pension system was corrupt and inadequate, with many deserving veterans receiving nothing. The orphan care on the frontier was minimal and often abusive. Orphanages were overcrowded, underfunded, and poorly managed. Many orphans were placed in indentured servitude or simply abandoned. The mortality rate among orphans was astronomical. The elderly care on the frontier was non-existent. There were no nursing homes, no social security, and no Medicare. When people became too old to work, they were often abandoned by their families or left to die. The concept of retirement was unknown. People worked until they died. The disability care on the frontier was non-existent. People with disabilities were often viewed as cursed or possessed. There were no accommodations, no support services, and no understanding of disability. Many disabled people were simply left to die or were killed outright. The food safety on the frontier was a constant concern. There were no regulations, no inspections, and no standards. Food was often contaminated with bacteria, parasites, or toxic substances. Many people died from food poisoning or diseases transmitted through contaminated food. The water quality on the frontier was appalling. Most water sources were contaminated with human and animal waste, leading to frequent outbreaks of waterborne diseases. There were no water treatment plants, no purification systems, and no testing procedures. Clean water was a luxury that few could afford. The air quality on the frontier was terrible. The air was filled with dust, smoke, and other pollutants. There were no environmental regulations, no pollution controls, and no concern for air quality. Many people died from respiratory diseases caused by poor air quality. The noise pollution on the frontier was constant and overwhelming. The sounds of gunfire, construction, and industrial activity were constant. There were no noise ordinances, no quiet zones, and no concern for the effects of noise on human health. The waste management on the frontier was primitive and dangerous. Human waste was often dumped directly into water sources, leading to widespread contamination. There were no sewage systems, no garbage collection, and no waste treatment facilities. Disease spread rapidly through communities because of poor waste management. The pest control on the frontier was non-existent. Rats, mice, and insects were everywhere, spreading disease and contaminating food supplies. There were no effective pest control methods, and many people died from diseases transmitted by pests. The occupational safety on the frontier was non-existent. Workers faced enormous risks with no protection. There were no safety regulations, no protective equipment, and no workers' compensation. Industrial accidents were common and often fatal. The product safety on the frontier was non-existent. There were no safety standards, no testing procedures, and no quality control. Products often failed catastrophically, causing injury or death. Patent medicines were often toxic, and many people died from taking them. The transportation safety on the frontier was terrible. Stagecoaches overturned regularly, steamboats exploded, and trains derailed frequently. There were no safety regulations, no inspection procedures, and no oversight. Travel was extremely dangerous, and many people died simply trying to get from one place to another. The building safety on the frontier was minimal. Buildings were often constructed with substandard materials and techniques. Collapses were common, and many people died when buildings fell down. There were no building codes, no inspections, and no oversight. The financial safety on the frontier was non-existent. There was no deposit insurance, no fraud protection, and no consumer protection. Banks failed regularly, wiping out people's savings. Many people lost everything they had to financial scams and fraudulent schemes. The personal safety on the frontier was virtually non-existent. Violence was common, and law enforcement was minimal. People were robbed, assaulted, and murdered with frightening regularity. There was no 911 system, no emergency response, and no protection for victims of crime. The constitutional rights that we take for granted today were largely meaningless on the frontier. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and due process were luxuries that few could afford. The Bill of Rights was often ignored or openly violated by local authorities. The civil rights on the frontier were non-existent for most people. Native Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Chinese immigrants had no rights at all. Women had few rights and little protection. Children were viewed as property rather than individuals with rights. The human rights on the frontier were routinely violated. Slavery was legal in many territories, and even free people of color faced constant discrimination and violence. Genocide was committed against Native American tribes, and entire communities were wiped out. The labor rights on the frontier were non-existent. Workers had no right to organize, no right to strike, and no right to safe working conditions. They were often paid in company scrip rather than real money, and they were forced to buy goods from company stores at inflated prices. The consumer rights on the frontier were non-existent. There were no warranties, no return policies, and no consumer protection laws. People were often cheated by unscrupulous merchants, and they had no recourse. The property rights on the frontier were often meaningless. Land could be seized by those with more power or better connections. Many people lost their homes and farms to corrupt officials or powerful interests. The privacy rights on the frontier were non-existent. There was no concept of privacy, and people's personal lives were often public knowledge. Mail was routinely opened and read by others, and there was no protection against surveillance or intrusion. The intellectual property rights on the frontier were non-existent. There was no copyright protection, no patent protection, and no trademark protection. Ideas and inventions were stolen regularly, and there was no recourse for the victims. The environmental rights on the frontier were non-existent. There was no concept of environmental protection, and the natural world was exploited without regard for the consequences. Entire ecosystems were destroyed, and there was no concern for the long-term effects. The animal rights on the frontier were non-existent. Animals were often treated with extreme cruelty, and there were no laws protecting them. Many species were hunted to near extinction, and there was no concern for animal welfare. The cultural rights on the frontier were often violated. Native American cultures were systematically destroyed, and their religious practices were outlawed. Many languages and traditions were lost forever. The artistic rights on the frontier were limited. There was little appreciation for art, music, or literature. Most people were too busy surviving to engage in creative pursuits, and those who did were often viewed with suspicion. The recreational rights on the frontier were limited. There were few opportunities for leisure or entertainment. Most people worked from dawn to dusk, and there was little time for recreation. The educational rights on the frontier were limited. Most children received no formal education, and those who did often learned little beyond basic reading and arithmetic. Higher education was almost impossible to obtain. The healthcare rights on the frontier were non-existent. Medical care was primitive and often dangerous. Many people died from treatable diseases simply because there was no one available to treat them. The retirement rights on the frontier were non-existent. There was no social security, no pensions, and no retirement plans. People worked until they died, and there was no provision for the elderly. The disability rights on the frontier were non-existent. People with disabilities were often abandoned or killed. There were no accommodations, no support services, and no understanding of disability. The mental health rights on the frontier were non-existent. People with mental illness were often chained up or locked away. There was no understanding of mental illness, and no treatment was available. The substance abuse rights on the frontier were non-existent. Addicts were viewed as moral failures and left to die. There were no treatment programs, no support groups, and no understanding of addiction as a disease. The domestic violence rights on the frontier were non-existent. Women and children were completely at the mercy of abusive men. There were no shelters, no protection orders, and no legal recourse for victims. The child abuse rights on the frontier were non-existent. Children were often brutally disciplined and exploited. There were no child protection services, no reporting requirements, and no legal protections for children. The sexual assault rights on the frontier were non-existent. Victims had no recourse to justice, and perpetrators were rarely punished. Sexual assault was often viewed as the victim's fault. The human trafficking rights on the frontier were non-existent. Many people were forced into slavery or indentured servitude. There were no laws against human trafficking and no protection for victims. The reproductive rights on the frontier were non-existent. Women had no control over their own bodies, and many died in childbirth or from botched abortions. There was no birth control, no prenatal care, and no obstetric care. The marriage rights on the frontier were limited. Women were often forced into marriages they didn't want, and divorce was almost impossible to obtain. Child marriage was common and legal. The voting rights on the frontier were limited. Only white men could vote in most territories, and even they faced barriers and intimidation. Women, minorities, and poor people had no voice in government. The religious rights on the frontier were often violated. Many religious minorities faced persecution and violence. There was little tolerance for different beliefs, and religious freedom was often meaningless in practice. The press rights on the frontier were limited. Newspapers were often censored or shut down by local authorities. Journalists faced threats and violence for reporting the truth. The assembly rights on the frontier were limited. People had little freedom to gather or organize. Political meetings were often broken up by violence, and activists faced arrest and persecution. The petition rights on the frontier were limited. People had little ability to petition the government for redress of grievances. Local officials often ignored or suppressed petitions. The trial rights on the frontier were often meaningless. Trials were often rigged, and due process was rarely observed. Many people were convicted of crimes they didn't commit, while others were lynched without any trial at all. The cruel and unusual punishment prohibitions on the frontier were routinely ignored. Torture was common, and executions were often carried out in brutal ways. Prisoners were often worked to death or simply killed. The search and seizure protections on the frontier were meaningless. Law enforcement routinely searched people and their property without warrants or probable cause. Privacy was not respected, and people had no protection against unreasonable searches. The self-incrimination protections on the frontier were often ignored. People were often forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit through torture or intimidation. There was no right to remain silent and no protection against coerced confessions. The double jeopardy protections on the frontier were often ignored. People were often tried multiple times for the same crime until the desired verdict was reached. There was no protection against being prosecuted repeatedly for the same offense. The speedy trial rights on the frontier were meaningless. People often languished in jail for months or years without trial. The court systems were so backlogged and corrupt that justice was delayed indefinitely, and delayed justice was no justice at all. The public trial rights on the frontier were often violated. Many trials were held in secret, and the public was excluded. This allowed for even more corruption and bias in the judicial process. The impartial jury rights on the frontier were rarely respected. Juries were often packed with friends of the prosecution or intimidated into reaching predetermined verdicts. The concept of an impartial jury was largely theoretical. The confrontation rights on the frontier were often denied. Accused people frequently couldn't confront their accusers or cross-examine witnesses. This made it easy to convict innocent people based on false testimony. The compulsory process rights on the frontier were often meaningless. Accused people couldn't compel witnesses to testify on their behalf, making it almost impossible to mount an effective defense. The assistance of counsel rights on the frontier were largely theoretical. Most people couldn't afford lawyers, and there was no public defender system. Those who did have lawyers often found them to be incompetent or corrupt. Now imagine stepping off that train in Dodge City with your modern sensibilities, your soft hands that have never known manual labor, your body that has never experienced true hunger or thirst. Within minutes, you would be overwhelmed by the assault on your senses. The noise alone would drive you to distraction. The constant gunfire, the screaming of animals being slaughtered, the shouting of drunk men, the crying of sick children, the creaking of wagon wheels on rutted streets. Your first instinct would be to find food and water, but both would be your enemy. The water available to you would be brown with sediment and reeking of human waste. A single sip could give you cholera, which would kill you within days through violent dehydration, as your body expelled every drop of fluid through uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea. Your intestines would cramp with pain so severe that men would beg for death. The food available would be equally dangerous. The meat would be crawling with maggots, the bread would be hard as stone and infested with weevils, and the milk would be sour and contaminated with bacteria that would send you into convulsions of food poisoning. Even if you could afford the outrageous prices, a simple meal could cost the equivalent of $100 in today's money. You would be poisoning yourself with every bite. Your clothing, so normal in the modern world, would mark you as an easy target. Your clean, well-made clothes would announce to every predator within miles that you were a wealthy outsider with money to steal. Your soft appearance would signal that you were weak and inexperienced, unable to defend yourself. Within hours, you would be robbed, beaten, and possibly killed for the few dollars in your pocket. The heat would be unbearable. In summer, temperatures could reach levels that would literally cook your brain. Heat stroke would set in quickly, causing confusion, hallucinations, and eventually death. There was no shade to speak of, no air conditioning, no relief from the blazing sun that turned the frontier into a furnace. Your feet, accustomed to comfortable shoes and smooth surfaces, would be destroyed within hours by the rough terrain. The primitive boots available would offer little protection against the thorns, broken glass, and jagged rocks that littered every path. Your feet would be bleeding and infected before the sun set on your first day. The insects would torment you beyond endurance. Mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever would swarm around you in clouds. Flies would cover every surface, spreading disease from animal carcasses to human food. Fleas and lice would infest your clothing within hours, causing constant itching and spreading typhus and other deadly diseases. The wild animals would sense your weakness immediately. Rattlesnakes would be coiled under every rock and bush, ready to inject you with venom that would cause excruciating pain and death within hours. Scorpions would hide in your boots and blankets, delivering stings that could kill a grown man. Wolves would follow you, waiting for you to collapse from exhaustion or injury so they could tear you apart while you were still alive. But the human predators would be far worse than any animal. The frontier attracted the worst elements of humanity: psychopaths and killers who had fled civilized society to escape justice. These men would see you as easy prey, a soft target to be robbed, tortured, and murdered for sport. They would not hesitate to kill you for the clothes on your back, or simply for the entertainment value of watching you die. The psychological impact of the frontier would break your mind within days. The constant fear, the unrelenting hardship, the complete absence of comfort or security would drive you into madness. You would watch children die of diseases that could be cured with a single antibiotic pill in the modern world. You would see women die in childbirth from complications that could be easily treated today. You would witness acts of violence and cruelty that would haunt your nightmares for the rest of your short life. The social isolation would crush your spirit. You would be surrounded by people who viewed you as a threat or an opportunity to exploit. There would be no friendship, no kindness, no human compassion. Everyone would be focused solely on their own survival, and they would sacrifice you without hesitation if it meant saving themselves. The work required to survive on the frontier would destroy your body within weeks. Your soft hands would be shredded by rough tools and manual labor. Your back would be broken by the constant lifting and carrying required to maintain even a basic existence. Your lungs would be scarred by dust and smoke. Your joints would be worn out by the punishing physical demands of frontier life. The diseases that ran rampant on the frontier would overwhelm your immune system, which has been weakened by modern life. Smallpox, tuberculosis, diphtheria, and a dozen other killers would attack your body simultaneously. Without modern medicine, you would have no defense against these ancient enemies of humanity. The dental problems alone would drive you to suicide. Without modern dental care, your teeth would begin to rot within weeks. The pain would be constant and excruciating, making it impossible to eat or sleep. The infections from dental problems would spread to your brain, causing delirium and death. The eye problems caused by constant exposure to dust and bright sunlight would leave you partially or completely blind within months. There were no sunglasses, no eye protection, and no treatment for eye injuries or infections. Many frontier dwellers went blind by age 30. The hearing damage from constant exposure to gunfire and industrial noise would leave you deaf. There was no hearing protection, and the noise levels on the frontier were far beyond what the human ear can safely tolerate. The respiratory problems caused by breathing dust, smoke, and toxic fumes would destroy your lungs. Prairie lung, and other respiratory diseases were common killers on the frontier. Your modern lungs, accustomed to filtered air, would be particularly vulnerable. The skin problems caused by constant exposure to harsh weather and poor hygiene would cover your body in painful sores and infections. Skin cancer was common but undiagnosed, and many people died from skin conditions that are easily treatable today. The joint problems caused by hard physical labor and poor nutrition would cripple you within months. Arthritis, rheumatism, and other joint diseases were endemic on the frontier. There were no pain medications except alcohol and opium, both of which created more problems than they solved. The back problems caused by sleeping on the ground and performing heavy labor would leave you in constant agony. There were no chiropractors, no physical therapists, and no effective treatments for back injuries. The foot problems caused by poor footwear and rough terrain would make walking agonizing. Infected cuts, ingrown toenails, and other foot problems could lead to gangrene and death. The nutritional deficiencies caused by the limited frontier diet would ravage your body. Scurvy would cause your teeth to fall out and your wounds to refuse to heal. Rickets would deform your bones. Pellagra would cause dementia and death. The dehydration caused by the lack of clean water would shut down your kidneys and other vital organs. Your body would begin to consume its own muscle tissue in a desperate attempt to maintain basic functions. The sleep deprivation caused by fear, discomfort, and constant vigilance would destroy your mental health. Insomnia was epidemic on the frontier, and the lack of restorative sleep would make you vulnerable to every disease and injury. The stress of constant danger would flood your body with cortisol and other stress hormones, suppressing your immune system and making you vulnerable to every pathogen in the environment. Your modern body, accustomed to relatively low stress levels, would be unable to cope with the constant fight-or-flight response required for frontier survival. The altitude sickness experienced at higher elevations would leave you gasping for breath and suffering from severe headaches. Many frontier settlements were located at altitudes that would cause serious problems for people not acclimated to the thin air. The seasonal affective disorder caused by the long, dark winters would plunge you into deep depression. The psychological impact of months without sunlight, combined with the isolation and hardship, would drive many people to suicide. The cabin fever experienced during harsh winters, when people were trapped indoors for months, would cause violent outbreaks and mental breakdowns. Entire families would turn on each other, leading to murders and suicides. The culture shock of experiencing a society with completely different values and norms would leave you unable to function effectively. The social rules that govern modern behavior would be not only useless but potentially dangerous on the frontier. The communication barriers would isolate you even further. Many frontier dwellers spoke languages other than English, and even those who spoke English used dialects and slang that would be difficult for a modern person to understand. The currency problems would make it difficult to conduct basic transactions. The frontier used a bewildering array of currencies, including gold dust, silver coins, paper money from failed banks, and barter systems. Modern money would be worthless. The measurement systems used on the frontier were different from modern standards, making it difficult to conduct business or follow directions. Even basic concepts like time were measured differently, with many settlements operating on local solar time rather than standardized time zones. The legal systems were so different from modern law that you would have no understanding of your rights or obligations. What was legal in one territory might be a capital crime in another, and the laws changed frequently as new governments took power. The religious differences would create additional problems. Many frontier communities were dominated by religious extremists who would view outsiders with suspicion or hostility. Religious conflicts were common and often violent. The racial tensions would put you in constant danger regardless of your own race. The frontier was a powder keg of ethnic and racial hatred, and violence could erupt at any moment over the slightest provocation. The gender roles were so rigid and different from modern society that you would constantly violate social norms without realizing it. Women who acted with modern independence would be viewed as immoral or insane. Men who failed to demonstrate traditional masculine behaviors would be seen as weak and targeted for abuse. The age expectations were completely different from modern society. Children were expected to work like adults from a very young age, while adults were considered old and useless by age 40. The concept of adolescence did not exist. The family structures were often dysfunctional by modern standards, with arranged marriages, polygamy, and child brides being common in many areas. Domestic violence was not only accepted, but expected as a way for men to control their families. The educational expectations were minimal, with most people being completely illiterate. Knowledge that we take for granted today was unknown or considered. Superstition on the frontier. The technological expectations were centuries behind modern standards. Simple devices that we use every day would be viewed as miraculous or evil magic by frontier dwellers. The medical expectations were so primitive that modern first aid knowledge would seem like supernatural healing power. However, attempting to practice modern medicine without proper equipment and medications would likely do more harm than good. The sanitation expectations were non-existent, with human waste and garbage being dumped wherever convenient. The smell alone would make many modern people violently ill. The personal hygiene expectations were far below modern standards, with most people bathing rarely and wearing the same clothes for weeks or months at a time. The food preparation and storage methods were primitive and dangerous, with no refrigeration and minimal understanding of food safety. Food poisoning was common and often fatal. The water treatment methods were non-existent, with most people drinking whatever water was available regardless of its quality or source. The waste disposal methods were primitive and created constant health hazards. Human and animal waste contaminated water sources and breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects. The pest control methods were ineffective, with rats, mice, and insects being constant companions in most frontier dwellings. The fire prevention and suppression methods were primitive, with most buildings being highly flammable and no effective way to fight fires once they started. The construction methods were primitive and dangerous, with many buildings collapsing and killing their occupants. There were no building codes or safety standards. The transportation methods were slow, uncomfortable, and dangerous, with many people being killed or injured while traveling from one place to another. The communication methods were unreliable and slow, with important messages often taking weeks or months to reach their destination, if they arrived at all. The entertainment options were limited and often dangerous, with gambling, drinking, and violence being the primary forms of recreation. The social support systems were non-existent, with no safety net for those who became sick, injured, or unable to work. The economic systems were primitive and often based on barter rather than currency, making it difficult to accumulate wealth or plan for the future. The political systems were corrupt and often controlled by the most violent and ruthless individuals rather than the most qualified. The law enforcement systems were inadequate and often more dangerous than the criminals they were supposed to control. The judicial systems were biased and corrupt, with justice being determined more by wealth and connections than by facts or law. The military systems were poorly organized and equipped, offering little protection from external threats. The diplomatic systems were primitive, with conflicts often being resolved through violence rather than negotiation. The intelligence systems were non-existent, with communities having little warning of approaching threats. The emergency response systems were primitive, with no organized response to disasters or emergencies. The public health systems were non-existent, with diseases spreading unchecked through communities. The environmental protection systems were non-existent, with no concern for the long-term consequences of human activity. The resource management systems were primitive, with no sustainable approach to using natural resources. The population control systems were non-existent, with no understanding of the relationship between population growth and resource availability. The urban planning systems were non-existent, with towns growing haphazardly without regard for safety or efficiency. The infrastructure systems were primitive and unreliable, with roads, bridges, and other essential infrastructure being poorly built and maintained. The utility systems were non-existent, with no electricity, gas, or water systems in most areas. The information systems were primitive, with news and information traveling slowly and often being distorted in the process. The education systems were inadequate, with most people receiving little or no formal education. The research and development systems were primitive, with little scientific or technological advancement. The manufacturing systems were primitive and dangerous, with workers facing enormous risks for minimal pay. The agricultural systems were primitive and inefficient, with low yields and frequent crop failures. The trade systems were dangerous and unreliable, with merchants facing constant threats from weather, animals, and human predators. The financial systems were primitive and unstable, with banks failing regularly and people losing their life savings. The insurance systems were non-existent, with no protection against loss or injury. The retirement systems were non-existent, with people working until they died. The healthcare systems were primitive and often more dangerous than the diseases they claimed to treat. The mental health systems were non-existent, with mentally ill people being locked away or simply abandoned. The substance abuse treatment systems were non-existent, with addicts being viewed as moral failures. The domestic violence prevention systems were non-existent, with women and children having no protection from abusive men. The child protection systems were non-existent, with children being viewed as property rather than individuals with rights. The elder care systems were non-existent, with elderly people being abandoned when they could no longer work. The disability support systems were non-existent, with disabled people being viewed as cursed or possessed. The victim support systems were non-existent, with crime victims having no assistance or support. The witness protection systems were non-existent, with witnesses facing retaliation and death for testifying. The rehabilitation systems were non-existent, with criminals being punished rather than reformed. The prevention systems were non-existent, with no effort to prevent crime, disease, or other social problems. The monitoring systems were primitive, with no way to track or respond to emerging threats. The evaluation systems were non-existent, with no way to measure the effectiveness of programs or policies. The quality control systems were non-existent, with no standards for products or services. The accountability systems were non-existent, with no way to hold people responsible for their actions. The transparency systems were non-existent, with government and business operations being conducted in secret. The participation systems were limited, with most people having no voice in decisions that affected their lives. The representation systems were corrupt, with elected officials serving their own interests rather than those of their constituents. The checks and balances systems were inadequate, with power being concentrated in the hands of a few individuals. The separation of powers systems were non-existent, with the same people often serving as legislator, judge, and executioner. The civil liberties protection systems were non-existent, with individual rights being routinely violated. The human rights protection systems were non-existent, with genocide, slavery, and other atrocities being common. By the end of your first day on the frontier, you would understand the harsh truth that Hollywood never showed you. This was not a land of opportunity and adventure. This was a killing field where human life was cheap and death was always just a heartbeat away. You would not survive because survival required skills, knowledge, and toughness that take generations to develop. You would not survive because your modern body and mind were completely unprepared for the brutal realities of frontier existence. The romantic notion of the Wild West as a place where brave pioneers carved out new lives through hard work and determination was largely a myth created by dime novels and later perpetuated by Hollywood. The reality was far more brutal, far more hopeless, and far more deadly than any movie ever dared to portray. Most people who ventured onto the frontier died within the first year. Those who survived longer were fundamentally changed by the experience, hardened into something barely recognizable as human. They learned to kill without remorse, to steal without guilt, and to abandon their fellow human beings without hesitation. The frontier didn't create heroes, it created survivors, and the difference between the two was often measured in how many people you were willing to sacrifice to keep yourself alive. You would not survive a day in the Wild West because you are a product of civilization, and the frontier was the antithesis of everything civilization represents. It was a place where the strong preyed upon the weak, where violence was the ultimate arbiter of disputes, and where human life had less value than the cost of a bullet. It was a place where disease, starvation, exposure, and violence combined to create a perfect storm of human suffering that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who thought they could build better lives in the American wilderness. The frontier was not conquered by brave pioneers. It was survived by the lucky few who managed to avoid the countless ways it tried to kill them. And you, with your soft hands, your clean clothes, your modern sensibilities, and your complete lack of survival skills, would not be among the lucky few. You would become another unmarked grave in the endless prairie, another forgotten victim of the American frontier's insatiable appetite for human suffering. The myth of the Wild West persists because we need heroes, we need stories of triumph over adversity. And we need to believe that ordinary people can overcome extraordinary challenges through courage and determination. But the truth is far darker and far more complex than the myths we tell ourselves. The truth is that the American frontier was one of the most dangerous and deadly environments in human history, and survival was determined more by luck than by virtue. So the next time you watch a Western movie or read a frontier novel, remember that you are seeing a sanitized version of events that were far more brutal and hopeless than any storyteller dared to admit. Remember that for every heroic gunslinger or noble pioneer portrayed in popular culture, there were hundreds of ordinary people who died horrible deaths far from home, their stories never told, their sacrifices never acknowledged. The Wild West was not wild because it was free, it was wild because it was deadly. And you, like most people throughout history, would not have survived its relentless campaign to destroy anyone foolish enough to challenge its dominion over the American frontier.